So I'm going to be talking, as Christian mentioned, a little bit about history as a resource for digital production and design, and also drawing from some research from my first book that explored a politics of what I call digital universalism, a kind of framework that problematically assumes that a single digital future awaits us all. This is indeed a pretty exclusionary vision of technology, not least of which when it's presumed that that future is best stewarded by certain classes of Western technological experts, often male and often white, whether based in Silicon Valley or other dominant centers of technological innovation. And I'll be drawing from my work as an ethnographer of digital cultures in contemporary Peru, where you'd really find everything growing up from networks of urban and rural hack labs to large-scale government programs tied to information society for development growing at a pretty rapid pace all across the nation. This, for instance, is one such program, Peru's One Laptop Per Child program, launched in partnership with MIT University that became the largest deployment site of OLPC worldwide. So I'll be getting back to this project a little bit later in my talk, but more generally today I want to be exploring a couple of themes, two main themes in my talk today. Firstly, how the digital might be developing in ways that now operate in tension with historical consciousness, and what this has to do with programs and projects like OLPC. And secondly, how work against such developments might be growing most quickly and rapidly in some pretty new and surprising places that might be said to parallel the work of fields like that of critical informatics, feminist science, technology studies, and digital humanities, where design for inclusion has really been one of the central sort of prerogatives pressed for. Now, that first observation, that the digital might be developing in ways that counter historical consciousness, actually runs against what's become an increasingly popular assumption in many IT circles, that being that the larger the pools of data we can collect, the closer we can get to some true index of total reality. Big data scientists, for instance, like Victor Meyer-Schoenberger, have been reputed for stating that an asset of big data collection is that it allows data to simply be observed rather than interpreted. Data can now be observed rather than interpreted, right? In other words, while small data sets require interpretation in order for their meaning to be extracted, big data sets can simply speak their truth, more purely freed of a need for flawed and messy human interpretation. And we should keep in mind that even principal research scientists at places like Microsoft Research, so people like Kate Crawford or Dana Boyd, for instance, have been critical of these kinds of positions. And they've cautioned against what they call a mythology of big data that mistakenly holds that, quote, with more data comes greater accuracy and truth. Now, on one hand, this assumption and myth forgets that the work of creating data categories in and of itself is never freed from bias, something I'm sure I don't really need to belabor with this particular audience. But it also forgets that what counts as big data one year is almost always said to be small the following, right? So big data in some ways is always chasing itself. But on the other hand, it's not hard to recognize the promise of digital data when it's become obviously clear how incredibly productive we have become as both users and producers. So in a single minute, we're now said to generate more than 4 million Google searches, over 3.3 million Facebook posts, over 340,000 tweets. And even if you take just one particular segment, so take the realm of digital photography alone, without a doubt photography being a kind of defining kind of realm of cultural memory, it said that we generate more photos in just 2 minutes than in the entirety of the 19th century, which is obviously a lot. So in the US Library of Congress, we now have some 14 million analog photos in their holdings. Yet companies like Facebook host photo repositories that are almost 10,000 times as large as that. 10,000 times as the entirety of the Library of Congress's holdings of 14 million, right? So a lot. And while even before the age of digital photography, collecting institutions were already being overwhelmed by the volume of media that needed to be processed, it's evident that the volume of work for such potential processing has now multiplied many times over. So there's no question that on the individual user level, we're taking, uploading, sharing, swapping, right, more digital content than ever, and doing so for the better part on commercial platforms like Instagram or Facebook that are designed for such inventory creating and content sharing functions. But you don't need to undertake any prolonged analysis to recognize that all this content creating hasn't necessarily amounted to better memory or contextualization of such content. Uploading content can be easier than ever, but remembering that upload, what its content actually was, and why it was even uploaded to begin with, can be incredibly difficult. Even status updates from yesterday can become fast blurs and forget about content posts from over a week ago, right? Now, as a side note, and just to be fair, Facebook did recently launch a new On This Day tool, a memory notification tool, which took some 2 years of time to develop. And part of its delay, part of why it was that it took such a long time, so 2 years actually to roll out, was that it actually had to take various precautions to deliberately filter out bad or painful memories for users. So Valentine's Day, for instance, is reportedly treated especially carefully, and arguably could be said to function, to function more as a forgetting and devisibilization device than a memory-making one, which is something that you don't hear too much about in all the hype over digital inventories online, of course. In other words, Facebook and other social media may be great at allowing us to platform digital content we create. They do a lot of work as inventory-making devices for documenting and platforming the present and making us hyper-conscious of a certain now, in other words. But as memory devices that allow us to read the present, perhaps critically, against a near or distant past, or as platforms that facilitate a recollection and analysis of that past, particularly when it means wading through everything from the deep present, or asking us to do something other than manage our memories, right, as Facebook's application actually does, they seem to leave much to be desired. Jeffrey Schnapp, the founder of the Stanford Humanities Lab and Harvard's Meta Lab, reminds his audiences too that the problem is not just one that impacts individual users in the digital age, but actually also affects larger archiving institutions like museums, libraries, and national archives that are entrusted with preserving and showcasing historical archives so that publics are able to come into conversation with the past. These institutions, too, as Schnapp underscores, are faced with problems of rapidly growing material inventories that are becoming harder and harder to share and make accessible to growing publics. As Schnapp states, quote, "The problem knowledge institutions face today is not just one about space and resources, and the problem is not just digitizing everything, because the whole early history of major digitization efforts has shown us over and over again that digitization in itself doesn't really accomplish anything fundamentally in terms of access. The real question is, how do we make corpora that matter to a given community accessible in meaningful ways now that we're moving from big to titanic collections? How do we live and tell stories about and with such enormous collections, especially given that, cognitively speaking, humans are better equipped to deal with small rather than large sets of objects," end quote. Schnapp, in other words, underscores a kind of contradiction with the digital's relationship to making and sharing history. And he asks us to consider what happens to shared social memory and history in a context where accelerating digital inventories don't necessarily operate towards the development of a historical consciousness. And I would add that there's one added complication to consider when it comes to making and sharing from many global contexts. If we follow the observations of globalization and Latin American studies scholars like Walter Mignolo in books like Local Histories, Global Designs, we're reminded how large sectors of global societies have been and remain systematically excluded from official history making. Given this, is it possible that digitization can come to exacerbate or reproduce rather than work against what Mignolo has called a certain coloniality of knowledge? How, in other words, given the masses of data that seem to arise from global publics, could it be that the digital might work to silence or drown out certain voices? And how might it be engaged to address the problem of what centuries' worth of colonial politics had already designated and silenced as classes and broad peoples without history, right? That's Mignolo's terms, peoples without history. Here's Mignolo elaborating a little bit more on the concept of coloniality of knowledge. Coloniality of knowledge, he says, quote, "managed to make us believe that there are people without history, and that people without history are inferior beings that need to be civilized. Such arguments serve past 500 years to legitimate every process of appropriation, expropriation, and exploitation. But that fact that history is a Western concept doesn't mean that Western civilization was the only civilization to keep records of the past. Indeed, every known culture and civilization came up with a technology for recording the past," end quote. The problem that he's underscoring, in other words, is how those histories remain censored from the official record, with perhaps an issue now being how to make such records speak and be audible, even against the ever-expanding data pools of the present. Now, for this next section of my talk, I wanted to explore one space where I'd argue we can see this kind of ambivalent dynamic around the digital and historical consciousness unfolding. And this is just a screenshot of a key educational technology forum, the 2014 Virtual Educa Conference that was hosted that year in Lima, Peru, and held in Peru's Ministry of Culture. It was organized by the Organization of American States in collaboration with regional government ministries. and a pretty notable array of corporate sponsors, including Intel, HP, Google, Microsoft, Telefonica, and Oracle, amongst others. And indeed, the event was designed to fill the multi-story building of Peru's Ministry of Culture with some pretty elaborate demo areas and tech industry showcases featuring the latest in their lineup of education-oriented products. Everything from digital tablets to classrooms in the cloud, which was Google's design solution, was kind of intriguingly proposed for public schools all across Peru, even though the majority of schools in Peru operate on a daily basis, right, offline, and still do. Other corridors featured robot kit vendors, digital encyclopedias, and row after row of interactive touchscreen blackboards. Now, just for some background, for those of us following developments in and around global educational technologies, we know that in recent years they've been growing pretty rapidly all across places like Latin America. A whole range of nations, 17 at least documented in Latin America as of the end of 2012 alone, according to this International Development Bank report, had launched large-scale information technology for education programs, or what's kind of called for shorthand ICT for education, or ICT4D programs. Many such plans had their roots in prominent engineering institutions and companies in the West, and some of us might remember projects like the MIT launched One Laptop Per Child project, which made its splashy debut at the 2005 World Information Society Summit with Nicholas Negroponte, the founder of MIT's Media Lab, demoing what was intended to be the first laptop designed for the world's poor. That's what they called it. That was back in 2005. By 2009, Peru would extend nationwide deployment of OLPC to become the largest national partner with OLPC, putting nearly 1 million EXO laptops into urban and rural circulation across the country. All of which added up to, by conservative estimates alone, some $82 million in expenditures by Peru's Ministry of Education. So not a small price tag. And what you see there in this photo is basically the head. The guy standing there is Oscar Becerra, who was then the head of Peru's digital education initiatives and deployments with Mary Lou Jepsen. She was the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer of One Laptop Per Child back in 2008. And she's just sort of sharing the kind of swappability, modularity of various kinds of parts within the EXO laptop to a host of various Ministry of Education reps there. And it's been sites like Virtual Educa that have been key spaces where the ideas of global engineers and designers, including some of the IT world's most elite players, can come into conversation with designers and implementers of national education policies. Also in attendance in Virtual Educa, for instance, were literally thousands of public school teachers who had been brought into the site from the rural provinces of Peru, including from regions in the remote jungle and high Andes for the event, as well as to attend talks given by other corporate sponsors and government officials in attendance. This indeed was to fill a key part of its mission. Established in 2000 to foster multilateral cooperations in education, the Virtual Educa initiative is one that the OAS declares was founded to, quote, create new forms of exchanging information about the technological revolution we're living in now, to establish relationships of cooperation between educational institutions and private and public sectors, end quote. Several years following, various government heads could actually be seen affirming this message, with heads like Argentina's Minister of Education, Juan Carlos Tedesco, declaring at the 2008 Virtual Educa conference in Zaragoza that, quote, we are aware that this form of Virtual Educa has become the Ibero-American event of greatest importance on this topic in discussions and articulations around information and communication technologies and education, end quote. Now, there's no doubt that there's a lot of overblown promise here, not only around technology alone, but around what this particular socio-technological infrastructure and interface might actually produce. And STS scholars and social scientists and critical informatics, information scientists for sure have been quite curious about how these kinds of overblown promises and hype operate in contemporary innovation sectors. So anthropologists, for instance, like Kaushik Sundararajan, have studied hype in biotech sectors. And in his recent book, Biocapital, he argues how, quote, one can understand emergent biotechnologies, such as genomics in his case, only by simultaneously analyzing the market frameworks, that is, marketing discourse, hype, and hope within which they emerge, end quote. For him, such marketing technologies create powerful cultural conditions that are designed to reorder space. As he writes, quote, hype is a game constantly played in the future to generate the present that enables the future, end quote. But as it turns out, social scientists and academics aren't the only ones interested in hype. Turns out that business analysts and industry think tanks too have been invested in studying hype too. Probably the most widely cited, watched, and followed study within tech sectors on hype is Gartner's Hype Cycle Report, which has been evaluating market promotion and perceptions for over 20 years, and which in the year 2014 did so for about 2,000 technologies. When the report was released in late 2014, for instance, this is one of the business news articles, an article from Forbes that accompanied it, reporting on how the Internet of Things had now topped big data as the most hyped technology. And this year it was a self-driving car that topped the list, as these Wall Street Journal and Forbes article reports report on, with big data once again being outed. This funny visual, though, is part of what many look to the report for, and what arguably the report is most famous for, which is Gartner's hype cycle graph, essentially a representation of the life cycle stages projected from emerging technologies from conception stage to maturity. Gartner maps out 5 stages for technological development. Its first stage, it calls stage 1, the technology trigger stage. Stage 2, the peak of inflated expectations. Stage 3, the trough of disillusionment, right? That's that kind of dip down that you see there. Stage 4, the slope of enlightenment. And stage 5, the plateau of productivity, right? Our final stage. And you got to hand it to Gartner for their snappy titlings and use of alliterations. And yet it's no accident that such literary allusions are being made in their titlings. As Gartner says, quote, "This report tells a story of how technologies, services, and strategies evolve from market hype and excitement of value to becoming a mainstream part of business and IT." And it maps then emerging technologies, whether we're talking about the Internet of Things or gamification or self-driving cars, along this narrative path and projected trajectory, a process that we're told can take anywhere from 5 or 10 or slightly more years. Perhaps what's most interesting about this narrative from a critical technology and informatics perspective is that it actually acknowledges the stage of overpromise, right? It acknowledges the stage of over-elevated expectations and over-visibility precisely in the stage of the peak of inflated expectations, right? That kind of a peak that you see there, to the point of producing an inevitable deflation and a fall into the much dreaded trough of disillusionment. But not to worry, over time we're told a process of maturation is supposed to occur, and we're promised not only an entry into a slope of enlightenment that will follow, but a plateau of productivity as well. Sundararajan actually brings our attention to this temporal function and its game-like character, that hype has to overtly oversell the future in order to generate the present to be readied for its making. And I want to suggest that one other crucial turn appears to be occurring here, one that's less about generativity than about erasure, cancellation, and the potential wiping of the record. And I think we can ask if the process that hype depends upon isn't just an overt overselling of the future, but also calls for an explicit devisibilization or wiping and cleansing of the past. There is no attempt, for instance, in this forward movement at a recollection or an evaluation of the past. There's no moment of folding back over to consider or acknowledge a particular technology's relationship to other past projects or other past deployments. It's just a discrete object moving forward on the slope towards eventual enlightenment, just a forward progression towards an inevitable future of productivity. And indeed, we may see many projections and performances of the future in spaces like this. But what we don't see, and what's explicitly missing from all these elaborate investments and stagings, is history, whether around technologies or around labor or around local and national contexts and past deployments again. We don't see any references to past experiments in teaching machines, whether they were other university-launched ed tech initiatives like the Plato digital computing project that was launched from the University of Illinois in the 1960s and that was considered to be quite cutting edge for its time, or the teaching and testing aids patented by the Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner that created considerable public buzz, but also concern in the US back in the 1950s and 1960s around the question, as news headlines warned even then, of whether robots will quote unquote teach our children. Neither was there any mention of the fact that Peru had in fact a fairly long record, more than 15 years of national deployments around digital education that included the prominent Juan Huascarán project, launched all the way back in 2001, that promised, even back then, to network rural and urban classrooms alike. And perhaps most surprisingly, at Lima's 2014 Virtual Educa conference, there wasn't even any direct address of OLPC. The $82 million experiment that the nation had run since 2007 and that had distributed nearly 1 million laptops across the nation, including in the classrooms of many of the teachers present at Virtual Educa. So no one was talking about this project. There was no panel that was dedicated to it. Instead, the conference was used to announce to teachers in the packed auditorium we see to the right that a new national ed tech project had been designed and would shortly be deployed, now structured around the Intel Corporation's classmate computer, which was prominently visible and available for conference goers to sample and demo between sessions. And here's a message you'd hear later too from IT corporate reps like Matthias of Silicon Valley's Hewlett-Packard, speaking to a literally standing room audience of proven public school teachers. He explained that the company's own view on the contemporary challenges of educators in the digital age also involved new educational developments or new technological developments. And he said, quote, "We've worked in many countries, we've collaborated in many countries, and one of the challenges we've seen is that the education system in which we all participate is a system that's now obsolete. It is not a system that generates talent. It is not a system for personalized education. But here's the news I'm here to deliver. We're here to help you. We're here to support you in this process of technological adoption and practice. HP turned 75 this year as one of the world's leaders in technology. And all this experience we bring and make available to you to change lives and today to prepare for a better future, so count on us in this transformation," end quote. Such language and its calls to local workers to erase their past is without a doubt part of the coloniality of knowledge that Mignolo had referenced. But here such histories are framed as obsolete relics and obstacles to the real solution to justify their disposal, right? And it can just simply be lopped off now. Now, there's a lot more to say about that, but really in the interest of time, and to sort of get to the last section of my talk, I want to mention that those kinds of universalist sermons have not been without their local contests. There have always been, in fact, since the deployment of digital education technology initiatives in Peru began, ways that local actors have pushed back and ways that they have worked through interdisciplinary research teams and technology collaborations to do so. Software translation hackathons like this one, for instance, always work by drawing on diverse expertise sets. This one, for instance, is organized by rural and urban educators from across Peru and drew in geeks and media artists from across Latin America, indigenous community members from cities and provinces across Peru, and even prominent American and European free software activists like Alexi Lim or Bernie Innocenti from Google, who all traveled into Lima, Peru for the event and are all seen here working in the Escuelab Hack Lab together, where the goal was to produce translations of education-oriented free software applications. So very much unlike the message of HP's Matthias, where the past knowledge and expertise sets are framed as obsolete relics that can now be forgotten or disposed of, here we see work being done to interface and consistently draw in diverse epistemologies, standpoints, and histories as resources to build different kinds of technological futures. The Fab Lab at Lima's TechSoup University is another urban hack lab space. And like similar kinds of maker spaces, it indeed links itself to histories of hacker clubs and open learning networks, including ones like the Tech Model Railroad Club from MIT and the West Coast's Homebrew Computing Club that have quite a bit of lore and weight in Western hacker histories as open learning spaces. But these sites also see themselves as linked to other local histories, heritages, and traditions around technology, other than those that anchor Western hacker lore. Here, for instance, is a page published by the TechSoup Fab Lab's Michael Hurtado, who got to attend an annual Fab Academy where other global participants of the international network of Fab Labs, right, all basically get to interface with one another, right, as part of the Fab Academy. And here, what you see is his online workspace where you can see him sharing his application of a computer-controlled cutting tool that's pretty common amongst Fab Labs, which he used here to design a blueprint and cutout of a laser-traced alpaca. And of course, the trick with computer-controlled cutting, right, is to come up with complex designs, but ones that economize your use of primary material. In this case, he's using plywood. And you can see he's not done too badly there. And he specifies too to his audience, who in this case, again, are largely other young global designers linked together through the MIT Launch Fab Academy, that he's drawing his design inspiration from his heritage. This is a photo of his grandparents that he posted, and then who he writes as having been alpaca farmers for their entire lives. And he describes how they maintain a technique practiced by indigenous populations in the southern Andes around alpaca breeding, specifically Surrey alpaca breeding, which he also writes has supported the survival of populations of Quechua and Aymara peoples in the Puno region for centuries. So he draws upon, again, different epistemologies and ecologies of knowledge to signal them as fundamental towards marking his orientation around design. We also see hackathons being organized in the rural Andes by indigenous actors and language activists like Irma Alvarez and Aymar Copacati. And here we see that they brought together a mixed group of open source geeks and hackers from Barcelona, La Paz, and Lima, media artists from Cordoba and Quito, right, so capital cities from really across the Latin American region, traveling pretty far distances to come together. Indigenous language activists, too, were there from across the Andes, rural teachers from Puno's local towns. So actors, in other words, working across pretty far-reaching geographic divides, cultural divides, and cultural differences, disciplinary differences, but who all came together to work through a shared interest in developing what they hoped to be the first software interfaces in Aymara and Quechua for national laptop deployments. You could argue by calling the event a hackathon. They're linking their work to the kinds of hackathon practices practiced in Western engineering schools and leading IT companies, where midnight hackathons are performed as a means of expressing design power and prowess. But they describe their approaches to the digital as informed at least as much by other elements, by the genealogies that surround them of mixed media development and collaborations in the Andes, whether by indigenous educators and national vanguard movements like that famously represented by the indigenous journal Almauta, edited by the person often recognized to be the founder of Latin American Marxism, José Carlos Mariátegui, or to figures like Manuel Zeta Camacho, who we see here on the lower right, who led a movement for clandestine schools in the rural Andes in Puno to make classes accessible in Aymara for Aymara populations, and had to do so by night, by candlelight, for risk of being jailed in 1904. They also linked their work to the ethics of inclusive collaboration and design represented in vanguard projects at the turn of the century, like the Warisata Aymara School. Founded in the Bolivian Andes, it developed a public school model co-run by local communities and progressive educators that supported indigenous pedagogy around agricultural technologies, weaving technologies, and ceramics technologies that leverage inclusive collaborations between indigenous leaders and local educators from across the region at the time. Contemporary hackathons in the Andes like this one then also noticeably today begin with things like a cocoa leaf ceremony, what's called a despacho, that's led, in this case, by one of the participants, Francisco Anco Rodriguez, a native Aymara speaker and retired public school teacher from the nearby town of Acra. Such ceremonies involve a kind of ritualized prayer in Aymara, an offering to the Pachamama and the Apus, right, so the collective gods, and an invitation to the group to draw their shares of cocoa from a mound of cocoa leaves that remain at the center of the table for the rest of the activity, right? So this is the beginning of a hackathon that nonetheless begins with a cocoa leaf ceremony. And there's lots that's written about, generally, about the despacho ceremony within anthropology. But what's key to keep in mind for us is how in the Andean world, how such ceremonies are understood to place contemporary actors in dialogue with the past and spirits of the natural world with powerful forces, in other words, not entirely controlled by humans, not even Silicon Valley engineers, but with which we remain in routine dialogue on a daily basis. And such events can have powerful resonances for actors and can be sites from which to imagine and craft other possible futures around technology, digital collaboration, and other forms of global connection bridging pasts, presents, and futures. And although the three maker sites I just outlined indeed are quite distinct, what they might be said to share is a certain practice of what Walter Mignolo describes as movements towards a decolonialization of knowledge. In other words, in contrast to actions that aim to authorize only a single official history, these spaces work in defense of the countless global memories that have been silenced in the process. As Mignolo writes to describe such projects, quote, anchored in their particular local memories, they contribute to building a polycentric world of the future, multiply the options towards global futures, and prevent the danger of a single story around civilization or development from being authorized, end quote. They likewise represent attempts at moving beyond our, quote, disciplinary boxes that the feminist digital humanities scholar Tara McPherson has called for if needed if we too are to move and confront strategies of modularity that segment knowledge workers into versions of hyper-relevant or past relics, right, to cut out and segment sectors deemed non-optimal. And in her case, of course, in McPherson's case, that is, the non-optimal knowledge sets that she's most concerned about as at risk for being cut out and forgotten are within the humanities and social science sectors on US campuses, right? But such experimental, culturally hybrid civic hack lab spaces nonetheless have to contend with the ever-renewed pronouncements and expanding architectures of global investment that indeed intend to universalize their own versions of a digital future. So in closing, I think we might ask to echo Latin American STS scholars like Ida Medina, Ivan de Costa Marquez, and Christina Holmes, what new strategies we too might collectively imagine to catalyze new conversations across geographic and language divides, and engage other forms of local memory that indeed risk being silenced within the widening sea of the deep digital present.